I managed to find another place to hide. This time, I'm in an abandoned basement beneath an old country church. I barely escaped that old abandoned house. They arrived minutes after I turned off the transmission. I'm using power from an old generator I found down here. I don't know how long it will last, so I need to be quick. When I kissed the Cardinal's ring for the first time, I would never have imagined that I would witness the darkest secrets of the church. My name is Father Thomas, and for 20 years I served as a priest in 3 different dioceses. What I will reveal today has been systematically hidden for decades and may forever shake your view of the institution that many consider sacred. What you are about to hear is not easy, but the truth needs to be told. Silence. Silence became an accomplice to abuse. It was in 1998, in my second parish, when a 12-year-old boy came to the confessional. His voice shook. "Father, is it a sin to defend yourself when someone from the church tries to touch you?" At that moment, I felt my world collapse. Few people know this, but I discovered that it was not an isolated case. A system of transferring problem priests acted as a safety net, not for victims, but for predators. What I discovered next was even more disturbing. There was a meticulously structured mechanism within the church to transfer abusive priests to distant parishes. They used non-disclosure agreements with victims' families and manipulated internal investigations. The truth the Vatican hid was shocking. The canonical code became a shield against secular justice. In 2010, I had access to secret Vatican documents. As the bishop's temporary secretary, I found a red folder with detailed instructions on how to handle sensitive situations. Confidentiality forms, sample transfer letters, and even psychological evaluations manipulated to protect abusers. I photographed everything. The forbidden truth was there. It wasn't just a few bad apples, but an entire system designed to protect predators. What made me decide to break the silence was a meeting with a mother in 2015. She came to me devastated. "Father, my son was abused by the same priest who abused me when I was a child 30 years ago. It was the same priest, in the same diocese, moved around in circles for decades. The consequences of the church's scandals hit me like never before. That night, I knelt before the altar and made the hardest choice of my life, to leave the priesthood to speak the truth. The numbers that the church officially releases are just the tip of the iceberg. For every case reported, there are at least 10 that remain silent. In one diocese where I served, official records indicated 7 cases in 50 years. But in the restricted files, there was documentation of 68 internally resolved charges. Many victims never speak out because of fear, shame, or because they have been silenced with spiritual threats like "God will punish you if you harm the church." There is a rigid hierarchy within the church that facilitates this system of abuse. Young priests are conditioned to unquestioning obedience. Whoever dares to challenge risks everything. I've seen colleagues get completely destroyed for trying to report it. One was diagnosed with psychological problems when he tried to expose a cardinal. Fear is the most powerful tool to maintain silence and hide the hidden truth about the exorcisms of guilt that never happened. It was in 1998, in MMI's second parish, when that 12-year-old boy came to the confessional. I still remember the smell of old wood and incense that filled that small, dark space. His voice shook like a leaf in the wind. "Father, is it a sin to defend yourself when someone from the church tries to touch you?" At that moment, I felt my world collapse like a sandcastle hit by a merciless wave. The silence that followed between us felt eternal as I struggled to find the right words. The boy, I'll call him Miguel to protect his identity, had eyes that carried a weight that no child should bear. When I finally got him to open up, the story I heard left me in shock. One of the most respected priests in the diocese, Father Augusto, had been abusing him for months during catechism classes. What disturbed me most was not just the account of the abuse, but how Miguel had been convinced that it was his duty to serve the priest and that resisting would be an act against God's will. In the following days, a discreet investigation I carried out revealed something even more sinister. Miguel was not an isolated case. There were others, many others. Some parents had tried to speak out, but were silenced with a mix of spiritual intimidation and financial arrangements involving special donations to the diocese. The most shocking thing was discovering that Father Augusto had already been transferred twice before for pastoral reasons from parishes where unseemly rumors had emerged. There was a meticulously structured system of transfers of problem priests that acted as a safety net, not for the innocent victims, but for the predators in cassock. When reviewing parish records, something I did secretly at night, I noticed that priests with specific problems were systematically moved every 3 to 5 years, always before the accusations could gain sufficient traction. Gathering all my courage, I scheduled a private audience with the bishop. I remember his wrinkled hands holding a cup of expensive tea as I explained what I had discovered. As he spoke, his face changed, not one of shock or concern for the children, but of growing irritation at my intrusion. When I finished, I received only a cold look and a clear warning that I will never forget. Some things should not be discussed, Thomas. Think about your calling. Those words fell on me like ice. The man I revered as a spiritual guide was effectively telling me to ignore abuse against innocent children. That night, kneeling in my simple room, I faced the first major crisis of faith in my life. How could the church that I loved, which preached the protection of little ones, allow such horrors? And worse, how could it actively protect the perpetrators? The following week, Father Augusto was transferred to a rural parish 300 kilometers away. The official explanation was urgent pastoral need. As for Miguel, his family suddenly moved out of town. I later learned that they received a full scholarship for their son to a prestigious Catholic school in another state. Silence was bought, evidence dispersed. It was my first real contact with this dark side of the institution, but unfortunately, it would be far from the last. What I didn't know then, and what I would only discover years later, was that these cases were just the surface of a much deeper and more disturbing system that extended to the highest levels of the Vatican. A system that worked not through failure or negligence, but by deliberate design to protect the image of the Church above all else, even if it meant sacrificing the most vulnerable. Something inside me changed in those days. A seed of doubt was planted. A seed that would eventually grow and force me to face even more difficult truths about the institution to which I had dedicated my life. But at that moment, I still tried to convince myself that these were isolated cases, that the church as a whole was still good and holy, that the system could be fixed from within. How wrong I was. In 2001, I was assigned to assist in diocesan administration, working directly with confidential documents. It was there that I found the red folder marked simply "Special Cases" that contained explicit guidelines on how to handle allegations of abuse. The document, written in cold, bureaucratic language, outlined a complete protocol to protect not the victims, but the institution and its priests. The system worked in layers, like concentric circles of protection. The first step was always to quickly transfer the accused priest to a distant parish, preferably in another region where no one knew his history. I remember a specific case of Father Gregorio, accused by 3 children in a middle-class parish. Less than 48 hours after the first accusation came to the attention of the bishopric, he was sent to a remote border community where he continued his ministry as if nothing had happened. The official explanation: urgent pastoral needs. The second circle of protection involved confidentiality agreements with victims' families. I saw with my own eyes how it worked. A specialized team of lawyers linked to the diocese visited the affected families, often accompanied by a priest respected in the community. They offered financial compensation, usually disguised as scholarships or help for psychological treatment, conditional on the signing of strict confidentiality documents. This agreement protects your son from the trauma of a public trial, they said, omitting that it mainly protected the church from scandal. During a diocesan meeting in 2002, I witnessed how they manipulated internal investigations. An independent committee was formed to investigate allegations against 3 priests. Independent in name only, all members had deep ties to the diocese and depended on it financially in some way. Victims were interrogated in intimidating environments, often in the presence of several ecclesiastical authorities. The questions were designed to create doubt. Are you sure you didn't misinterpret the priest's intentions? Have you had problems with lying in the past? Isn't your family looking for easy money? The 4th element of this perverse system was the pressure on witnesses. An entire family was practically expelled from the community after their teenage son testified on behalf of an abused friend. Rumors began to circulate about his mental problems. His local parish suddenly had no Sunday school spaces for his youngest children, and even job opportunities for his parents mysteriously disappeared. The message was clear to anyone watching: support the victim, and you will become one too. Finally, I saw how the canonical code, the church's internal legal system, was used as a shield against secular justice. When civil authorities began to ask questions, the answer was always the same. This is an internal church matter, already being investigated under canon law. They invoked confessional secrecy, religious autonomy, and centuries of tradition to keep cases out of civil courts. And when that failed, a discreet call from a bishop to a Catholic politician or judge often did the trick. This system did not form by chance or neglect. It was built deliberately over decades, protecting the institution above all else, even if it meant sacrificing the most innocent. The scariest thing is that it worked with mathematical precision, every cog fitting together perfectly to create a machine of silence. On one occasion, during a retreat for priests, a veteran Monsignor, after a few glasses of wine, confided something to me that I have never forgotten. Thomas, the Church has survived empires, wars, and heresies. It will survive this too. Our mission is to protect Peter's bark, not each individual sailor. That cold metaphor, comparing abused children to mere expendable individual sailors, revealed to me the institutional mindset that allowed such horrors to continue. The more I learned about this system, the more I felt trapped in an impossible moral dilemma. How could I continue to faithfully serve an institution that behind its facade of sanctity operated with such calculated cruelty? I was beginning to realize that the real sin was not just that of individual abusers, but the institutional sin of a system designed to protect them at the expense of innocent children. And even worse, I was becoming part of this system. In 2005, the case occurred that almost completely destroyed my faith, an episode that haunts me to this day in my darkest nightmares. That's when I met Marcus, a brilliant young seminarian of just 22 years old. I vividly remember the day he knocked on my parish office door. It was raining heavily outside, and he was drenched, not just from the storm, but from the tears running down his pale face. His red, swollen eyes told a story before his words could. Marcus had grown up in a deeply Catholic family in the countryside. Since he was a child, he dreamed of becoming a priest, to serve God and protect the vulnerable, as he always said. He was an exceptional student, spoke 3 languages, and had an understanding of theology that impressed even the most demanding professors at the seminary. Everyone predicted a bright future for him in the church. He could one day become a bishop, perhaps even a cardinal. That rainy afternoon, between sobs and long silences, Marcus told me about the abuse he had been suffering for years at the hands of Monsignor Valerio, one of the most respected priests in the diocese and spiritual director of the seminary. The abuse began with accidental touching, evolved into special blessings that required Marcus to be undressed for spiritual purification, and culminated in graphic sexual assaults. He said it was a special form of spiritual direction, Father Thomas, Marcus explained, his voice barely above a whisper. He said that this was how true leaders of the church were formed, that we needed to learn complete submission. Most disturbing was how Valerio intertwined abuse with sacred rituals and theological language, creating a devastating confusion in the young seminarian's mind between devotion to God and submission to his predator. Father Thomas, if I talk, no one will believe me, Marcus said, looking out the window at the cross at the top of the church. He's practically a saint to everyone. He celebrates masses for crowds, writes spiritual books, knows bishops and cardinals. What about me? I'm just a country boy. That moment was a turning point in my life. I saw before me not only Marcus's pain, but the choice that would define what kind of priest, what kind of man I would be. He could do like so many others, advise discretion, suggest a transfer to another seminary, cover up yet another case to protect Peter's boat, or he could finally face the system. I chose to face it. I helped Marcus document everything, dates, locations, details of the abuse. Together we prepared a detailed report that we sent directly to the bishop, with copies to the Apostolic Nuncio, Vatican representative, and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome. I naively believed that with such detailed evidence and a victim willing to testify, the system would be forced to act correctly. The response came surprisingly quickly, but not in the way we expected. A week later, Marcus was called in for an emergency vocational assessment. In a meeting lasting just 15 minutes, he was informed that he was being expelled from the seminary for conduct incompatible with the priestly vocation and for defamation against a superior. His possessions were packed up by other seminarians. He was not even able to return to his room. He was escorted out like a criminal. As for Monsignor Valerio, far from facing any consequences, he was quietly transferred to Rome, where he received a promotion to an administrative position at the Vatican, a move that removed him from direct contact with seminarians, but which also elevated him in the hierarchy and further protected him from any local investigation. I tried to keep in touch with Marcus over the next few weeks. He had returned to his parents' house, devastated. His devoutly religious family could not understand how the son, who had always been the pride of the community, had been expelled from the seminary. The rumors, carefully planted, were already circulating. Suggestions of inappropriate behavior, emotional instability, even hints about his sexuality. The silence machine worked with brutal efficiency. 3 months later, I received the news that broke my heart. Marcus had taken his own life. They found him in his room with a rosary clasped in his cold hands and a letter that said simply, "God knows the truth. I carry this guilt with me every day. I should have done more. I should have predicted how the system would react. I should have better protected that young man who trusted me." The funeral was a final demonstration of the hypocrisy that had become unbearable to me. The same bishop who allowed his expulsion presided over the ceremony, speaking about mysteries of faith and incomprehensible ways of God. No one mentioned the true circumstances. Nobody talked about Monsignor. Nobody took responsibility. It was during that funeral, watching Marcus's broken family and empty talk about divine mysteries, that something definitively broke inside me. I realized that I was serving not God, but an institution that had become adept at sacrificing the innocent on the altar of its own reputation. The spiritual consequences of that moment continue to reverberate in my soul to this day. After Marcus's death, I entered a dark period. For almost 2 years, I continued to perform my priestly duties, but it was as if I was operating on automatic, a ghost in a cassock. I celebrated masses, heard confessions, visited the sick, but one question constantly tormented me. Am I serving God or a corrupt institution? This silent crisis was my own Garden of Gethsemane, where I sweated drops of spiritual blood as I wrestled with my conscience. In 2010, the definitive turning point occurred, the moment when my eyes were completely opened to the truth that the Vatican was hiding. The bishop of my diocese suffered a mild stroke and had to temporarily leave. By a strange chance, or perhaps divine providence, I was appointed as his temporary secretary in charge of keeping correspondence and the most sensitive documents in order during his recovery. It was during my 3rd week in this role that I encountered something I should never have seen. At the bottom of a locked file cabinet in the episcopal office was a red folder with the official Vatican seal. What caught my attention was not just the seal, but the classification printed in Latin: crimen sollicitationis, special procedures, strictly confidential. I remember the weight of that folder in my hands, like carrying lead, not paper. With my heart racing, I began to examine its contents. What I found there was definitive proof of everything I had suspected over the years, but on a scale I never imagined possible. The folder contained detailed instructions sent directly from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on how to deal with what they euphemistically called sensitive situations, cases of sexual abuse committed by clergy. There was a complete procedures manual that appeared to have been updated periodically over the past few decades. The document focused not on how to protect children or deliver justice, but on how to protect the Church's reputation at all costs. Among the documents, I found pre-printed confidentiality forms written in dense legal language that few lay people would fully understand, that victims' families were required to sign. These documents not only silenced victims with threats of excommunication if they spoke publicly, but also prevented them from seeking out civil authorities. There were template letters for transfers of problematic priests with carefully coded language. Phrases like "needs a different pastoral environment" or "seeking new ministry challenges" were euphemisms for transferring abusers without arousing suspicion. An attached guide explained how to give positive references over the phone, while conveying through certain code phrases the real nature of the problem to the receiving bishop, who would then know to place the priest away from schools or youth groups without ever revealing the reason to the community. Even more disturbing were the protocols for manipulated psychological assessments. The folder contained names of church-friendly clinics and psychologists who would produce favorable reports. One memo explained how to frame abusive behavior as an isolated episode due to stress, or overcome after spiritual intervention, even in cases of serial predators. There were also guidelines on how to discredit victims, investigating their past for problematic behaviors, questioning their emotional stability, or suggesting that they had misinterpreted innocent actions. One particularly cynical document listed tactics for identifying families vulnerable to financial or social pressures who would be more likely to accept silent agreements. Most shocking was a statistical report that accompanied the documents. Cold numbers that revealed the true extent of the problem. In our diocese alone, which seemed so peaceful and holy in the eyes of the faithful, there were records of 42 accused priests in the last 3 decades, involving more than 200 victims. Of these cases, only 3 had been made public. The others were buried under layers of purchased and imposed silence. That night I stayed at the office until late. With shaking hands and a heavy heart, I methodically photographed each page of those infamous documents. I didn't have a clear plan for what I would do with this evidence, but I knew I needed to preserve the truth, even if only as testimony for my own conscience. What I didn't know was that a discreet security camera installed after a theft the previous year had captured my actions. 3 days later, I was called before the Vicar General. With an icy glare, he informed me that I was being immediately removed from the secretary position and transferred to a small rural parish on the edge of the diocese, practically an exile. The bishop was deeply disappointed by "Your indiscretion, Father Thomas," he said. "Absolute loyalty is expected from those who serve so closely with episcopal authority." There was no direct mention of the photographs or documents, just a veiled threat. Certain actions can have severe canonical consequences, as you well know. The message was clear: I was being watched, and any attempt to use that information would result in my destruction within the church. If you are watching this video and have already witnessed how powerful institutions silence the truth, leave a reveal in the comments. We need to show that we are not alone in this fight for the truth. In that small rural parish, among literal and figurative sheep, I had plenty of time to contemplate what I had discovered. Those documents definitively proved that the problem was not just a few bad apples, as the hierarchy always publicly insisted, but an entire system meticulously designed to protect predators at the expense of their victims. It was a machine of silence that operated with the precision and coldness of a multinational corporation protecting its assets, except the assets here were abusers, and the collateral damage were innocent children. For almost 5 years, I stayed in that isolated rural parish. St. Francis of Assisi was its name, an irony that was not lost on me. The small stone church with its crooked bell tower served around 300 worshippers spread across farms and small villages. Isolation was both a punishment and a refuge. Far from the main centers of ecclesiastical power, I celebrated masses, baptized children, visited the sick, and conducted funerals. The days followed one another, similar to the beads of an immense rosary. I kept photographs of secret Vatican documents stored on an encrypted drive. Sometimes, during sleepless nights, I would revisit those pages, not to torture myself, but to not forget, to not allow myself to be lulled again into the illusion that I served a fundamentally good institution with only a few problematic elements. Time passed. I grew old prematurely in that place. My hair darkened and the beard I grew began to show gray strands. My eyes gained wrinkles at the corners, some from smiles at my parishioners, many from nights of silent crying. It was in 2015 that the breaking point occurred, the moment that finally shattered any remaining ties that tied me to the institution. One rainy afternoon in April, a woman knocked on the door of the rectory. Helena was around 40 years old, with deep-set eyes and hands that couldn't stop shaking. His teenage son, Gabriel, waited in the parked car in the rain. "Father, I need to talk about something that happened to my son," she said, after I settled her in the small room and served her chamomile tea. His voice shook as much as his hands. "Something terrible, with Father Antonio." The name hit me like a physical punch. Father Antonio Carvalho. I knew that name from the secret documents I had photographed years before. His name appeared multiple times in records of sensitive situations, with at least 7 transfers in 3 decades. Helena continued, the words coming out like a broken dam. "Gabriel started being an altar boy 6 months ago, when we moved to Sacred Heart Parish. At first he was so happy. He always wanted to serve at the altar. But then he started making excuses not to go to church. He got sick on Sunday mornings. His grades dropped. I found him crying in the shower." She stopped, took a deep breath. "Yesterday, he finally told what was happening. Father Antonio, his voice trailed off. I had heard similar stories over the years. I thought I was anesthetized. I was mistaken. Each new case was a fresh stab. Father Thomas, I came to you because I don't know what to do. When Gabriel told me, I broke down because his eyes met mine, filled with old and new pain simultaneously. Because the same Father Antonio abused me when I was 13 years old. That was more than 30 years ago, in the parish of Nossa Senhora da Conceição. Time seemed to freeze. The same predator, 3 decades later, still active, still protected by the same system that I had discovered in the documents, still destroying lives, now across generations. I never told anyone at the time, Helena continued. He said that no one would believe me, that I would lose my soul if I spoke against a priest of God. I carried that shame alone for decades, and now, tears streamed down his face. And now my own son. At that moment, something definitively broke inside me. I was not just witnessing the sins of other men. My silence, my participation in the system made me complicit. Every mass I celebrated, every homily on truth and justice, became hypocrisy as long as I remained inside an institution that I knew was systematically protecting predators. Helena, he said finally, I'm going to help you and Gabriel, but not in the way you expect. I'm not going to refer this to the bishop or a diocesan commission. We're going to the police today, now. His eyes widened. But Father, the church. This is no longer about the church. It's about justice, about stopping more children from suffering. That same afternoon, I accompanied Helena and Gabriel to the police station in the neighboring city. For the first time in my life as a priest, I acted completely outside of ecclesiastical protocols. The delegate, a serious man named Souza, took the statements with professionalism and compassion. When I mentioned that there was reason to believe there were more victims and a pattern of transfers to protect Father Antonio, he looked up from the forms with renewed interest. Father, would you be able to prove this statement? For a moment I hesitated. The drive with the photographs of the documents was hidden under a loose board on the floor of my room. Using it would mean crossing a point of no return. Yes, I finally replied. I have proof. That night, after returning from the police station, I knelt before the altar of the small, rural church. The crucified Christ seemed to look directly at me in the flickering candlelight. For hours, I lay there in a spiritual agony that I can only compare to Gethsemane itself. So with a clarity I had never experienced, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I would leave the priesthood to tell the truth. The institution I had sworn to serve, that I loved deeply, had become a haven for predators, and I could no longer be part of that system. Forgive me, Lord, I whispered to the crucifix. I swore to serve you through this church, but now I see that I can better serve your truth outside of it. The next morning, I wrote 2 letters. The first for the bishop, formally resigning from the priestly ministry, citing a crisis of conscience. The second to an investigative journalist from a major national newspaper, attaching copies of documents he had kept for so many years. The consequences of this decision would be profound and irrevocable, but for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. My resignation letter caused less of a fuss than I imagined. As if the hierarchy were relieved to quietly get rid of a problematic element, I received a cold communication from the diocesan chancellor informing me that my request had been accepted and forwarded to Rome for formal laicization procedures. I was told to leave the parsonage in 2 weeks, and told I would receive minimal transitional assistance, enough to rent a small apartment for a few months. The journalist, however, reacted with shock and disbelief upon examining the documents. "This is pure dynamite, Thomas," he said at our first meeting in a discreet cafe in the capital. "We must proceed with extreme caution. The church has powerful lawyers and connections at all levels of the judiciary and media." Over the next few weeks, as the newspaper meticulously checked each document and sought independent corroboration, I began to systematically compile everything I knew about the true extent of the abuse. It was then that I realized the frightening magnitude of the numbers conspiracy, the deliberate disparity between the official statistics and the grim reality hidden in the secret files. The numbers that the church officially disclosed in its transparency reports were just the tip of a monstrous iceberg. In my 20 years as a priest, serving in 3 different dioceses, I have witnessed a consistent pattern. For every case reported publicly, there were at least 10 that remained buried in confidential files, sealed by gag agreements, or simply denied until they disappeared. In the diocese where I served as temporary secretary, official records indicated just 7 cases of abuse in 50 years, a number the bishop often cited as proof that the problem was rare and isolated in his jurisdiction. But in the restricted files I had access to during those fateful weeks, there was detailed documentation of 68 allegations that were resolved internally, a euphemism for cases stifled through intimidation, strategic transfers, and financial deals. What was most disturbing was not just the numerical disparity, but the sophisticated methods used to keep these numbers artificially low. They had developed an elaborate taxonomy to reclassify cases so that they did not appear in official statistics. Accusations were labeled non-sexual misconduct, boundary violations, or reckless behavior, all to avoid terms like abuse or assault that would trigger more stringent protocols. Other cases were completely omitted based on Kafkaesque technicalities. If the victim was over 17 years and 11 months old, it was not classified as child abuse. If the perpetrator was a seminarian not yet ordained, it did not count as clerical abuse. If it occurred on non-parochial property, it was considered outside diocesan jurisdiction. The most heartbreaking thing was understanding why so many victims never spoke. During my research, I interviewed dozens of survivors whose cases never made it into official statistics. Their testimonies revealed a consistent pattern of silencing through multiple mechanisms. Fear was prevalent, not just fear of the attacker, but of not being believed when a child's word was opposed to that of a man of God. For deeply religious families, this was an impossible dilemma. Shame was also silent, especially in traditional communities where issues of sexuality were taboo. Many boys and young men carried the additional burden of questions about their masculinity and sexuality following abuse. Spiritual manipulation was perhaps the cruelest of tactics. Victims reported being told that God will punish you if you harm the church, or that causing a scandal is a more serious sin than what happened to you. Some were told that the abuse was a God-sent ordeal, or even a punishment for past sins. One young man I interviewed, now in his 30s, described how the priest who abused him for 3 years during his teenage years convinced him that he was chosen by God for a special relationship, and that saints also went through experiences that others would not understand. The distortion of religious concepts was so profound that he only recognized the abuse a decade later, during therapy. Another disturbing pattern emerged when I began mapping the 68 cases from that diocese. The recurrence of certain names. A single priest had accumulated 12 accusations over 25 years of ministry, all resolved without ever appearing in public records. He had been transferred 7 times, always to rural parishes, where the families were more traditional, more reverent of clerical authority, and less likely to question. The implications were clear and devastating. We were not dealing with isolated incidents of a few problem priests, but with an institutional system of protection that not only enabled abuse, but effectively created the conditions in which predators could continue indefinitely. During my investigation, I discovered a particularly disturbing internal memo written by a canonical consultant for the Conference of Bishops. He warned against implementing zero-tolerance policies with these words: "If we implement drastic measures and fire all priests with credible accusations, we will face a critical staffing crisis in more than 60% of dioceses." The real numbers were so devastating that the institution itself feared their revelation. A former seminary professor, now retired, who collaborated privately with my research, summed up the situation with brutal frankness. The Church has always been good at dealing with scandals. The problem with this particular scandal is its scale. If the true extent were revealed, it could destroy institutional credibility for generations. As I compiled this data, it became painfully clear that we were not talking about dozens or hundreds of cases, but a global, systematic problem affecting tens of thousands of victims. And for every number, there was a devastated human life, a shattered faith, a trauma that transcended generations. The conspiracy of numbers was not just a matter of statistics, it was a calculated betrayal of the most vulnerable souls entrusted to the Church's care. To truly understand how such an extensive system of abuse could thrive for decades, perhaps centuries, we need to examine the power structures that sustain it. In my 20 years as a priest, I have witnessed firsthand how the church hierarchy not only allowed, but actively facilitated the systematic cover-up of abuse. This is not about coincidences or isolated failures, but about an institutional architecture deliberately constructed to protect power at any cost. The hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church is often compared to an army, with the Pope as supreme general, cardinals and bishops as senior officers, and priests as frontline soldiers. This comparison, although simplified, captures an essential element: the absolute obedience expected of each level towards the superior. From their first day in seminary, future priests are conditioned to internalize this chain of command as sacred. I vividly remember the first weeks of priestly formation. The seminary's rector, Monsignor Almeida, gathered us in the old auditorium with its stone walls and imposing crucifix for what he called the most important lesson of all. With a solemn voice and piercing gaze, he recited, "Obedience to the bishop is non-negotiable. When ordained, you will take a solemn oath of obedience. This means that when the bishop speaks, God speaks. Questioning a superior is not just insubordination, it is a serious spiritual failure." This doctrine of unquestioning obedience is reinforced through multiple mechanisms during the 6 to 8 years of training. Seminarians who demonstrate independent thinking or question superior decisions are systematically identified as problematic or lacking a true vocation. Those who conform are rewarded with approval, privileges, and advancement in the ecclesiastical career. The result of this prolonged conditioning is the creation of a class of clergy who have deeply internalized the imperative to protect the institution above all else, even above justice for victims of abuse. A seminary classmate once confided to me after a few glasses of wine, "We were trained to be soldiers of Christ, but we ended up becoming the institution's Praetorian guards." The system is maintained not just through conditioning, but continuous surveillance and veiled threats. Diocesan priests live under constant scrutiny from their peers, their superiors, and often from parishioners connected to the hierarchy. Any sign of disloyalty is quickly reported and can result in devastating consequences. I have witnessed these consequences firsthand. Father Ricardo, a colleague in my second diocese, discovered evidence that an influential Monsignor had abused 3 teenagers in a youth group. Naively, Ricardo followed official protocol. He documented the accusations and presented them directly to the bishop, trusting that justice would be done. 2 weeks later, Ricardo was summoned for an emergency psychological evaluation with a psychiatrist appointed by the diocese. The diagnosis was already predetermined: delusional disorder and paranoid tendencies, supposedly manifested by his unsubstantiated allegations against a respected clergyman. He was removed from his pastoral duties and sent for treatment to a discreet clinic run by a religious order, where he was heavily medicated for 6 months. When he returned, he was just a shadow of the vibrant priest he had been. Another, even more disturbing case was that of Father Felipe, who tried to take directly to the Apostolic Nuncio, Vatican representative, evidence that a cardinal had covered up multiple cases of abuse, 2 nights after his audience with the nuncio, Felipe's parish residence was invaded by unknown thieves who took only his computer and personal documents. A week later, alleged inappropriate conversations between Felipe and a married man began circulating on social media, later proven to be falsifications. But the damage had already been done. Felipe was quickly sent to a spiritual retreat in an isolated monastery in the Italian Alps. In fact, a psychiatric clinic, where he was held against his will for almost a year, diagnosed with persecutory delusions and medicated so heavily that he could barely articulate coherent thoughts. When he finally managed to contact his family and was rescued through legal intervention, he discovered that he had been formally stripped of his priestly duties for scandalous behavior. These are not isolated cases. The system has developed sophisticated methods to neutralize those who dare to speak out. The most common is the use of psychological assessments as a weapon, labeling whistleblowers as mentally unstable, turning truth into delusion, and moral courage into personality disorder. Another frequent tactic is death by transfer. A priest who raises concerns is sent to increasingly remote and troubled parishes, a punishment disguised as a pastoral need. In extreme cases, accusations of misconduct are fabricated or amplified, destroying reputations and credibility. Fear, therefore, becomes the most powerful tool to maintain silence. Not just fear of punishment, but fear of losing everything: calling, community, identity, life purpose. A priest who spends decades at the institution rarely has skills transferable to the secular world. His entire identity is intertwined with his clerical role. Challenging the system means risking not just your livelihood, but your very sense of who you are. As an old Monsignor told me in a rare moment of candor, the Church does not need a secret police. We police ourselves out of fear of the bishop, fear of scandal, fear of Rome, and ultimately fear of ourselves and what would happen if we started to question too much. This system of power and control is precisely what makes covering up abuses not only possible, but practically inevitable. When unquestioning obedience is valued above moral conscience, when the protection of the institution trumps the protection of the vulnerable, it creates the perfect environment for predators to thrive. If you are watching this video and recognize these patterns of abuse of power in any institution, share it with 3 people who need to hear this truth. Use the hashtag #ArquebreoSilencio to help this message reach those who need it. The most tragic thing is that this system not only fails to protect the innocent, it actively sacrifices them on the altar of institutional appearance. During my years in the priesthood, especially after I left the ministry and began working with survivor support groups, I witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences that clerical abuse leaves on victims. What many do not understand is that this specific type of abuse carries an additional dimension of trauma, spiritual betrayal, that makes its scars particularly deep and lasting. The scars left on victims go far beyond the immediate physical trauma. When abuse comes at the hands of someone who represents God on earth, someone who has been taught to revere as another Christ, the violation penetrates to the person's spiritual core. It is an existential wound that few can truly understand if they have not experienced it. Carlos, now 42 years old, was abused from the age of 11 to 14 by a respected priest in his community. When we met in a support group, he described to me the devastating effect on his ability to trust. "I can't walk into a church without feeling nauseated. I can't hear prayers without remembering the words he whispered as he raped me. I've lost not just my faith, but my fundamental ability to trust any authority figure, teachers, doctors, bosses. I live in a constant state of alert, expecting betrayal." This pattern of complete break with faith is common among survivors. Research conducted by a trauma center I collaborated with showed that approximately 78% of victims of clergy abuse completely abandon their religious beliefs. As one survivor told me, "How can I believe in a God who allowed his representative to destroy me. He either doesn't exist or he doesn't care about me. Another devastating consequence that I have observed repeatedly is the development of addictions as a coping mechanism. Miguel, abused by a priest during spiritual retreats, developed severe alcoholism at age 16. "I started drinking to fall asleep," he explained to me during a counseling session. "It was the only way to silence his voice in my head, to not feel his hands on my body when I tried to sleep." At age 30, Miguel had already undergone 4 rehabilitation programs and lost a kidney due to alcohol abuse. The statistics are alarming. In a study of 350 clerical abuse survivors, 65% reported substance problems at some point in their lives. Self-medication becomes a survival strategy in the face of a trauma that seems impossible to process. Perhaps the most devastating consequence is the high incidence of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. Luisa, a 38-year-old woman abused by a priest during catechism classes, tried to take her own life 3 times before the age of 25. The first time was at 15, when I realized that no one would believe me against the word of the Holy Father. The suicide rate among survivors of clergy abuse is approximately 1.5 times higher than among victims of other types of sexual abuse. A devastating statistic that is rarely discussed in official church reports on the topic. The ability to form healthy relationships is another area that is profoundly affected. Andre, now 50 years old, has never been able to maintain a relationship for more than a few months. Physical intimacy triggers flashbacks to the abuse. Trust seems impossible. And what's worse, when someone gets close emotionally, I feel dirty, unlovable. It's like they've permanently contaminated my capacity for human connection. What greatly amplifies this suffering is the phenomenon of secondary victimization, the additional trauma inflicted by the very system that is supposed to protect and support victims. The vast majority of survivors I have worked with describe the process of trying to gain recognition and justice as traumatic as the original abuse. Camilla, abused from age 12 to 15 by a school chaplain priest, described her experience when she finally came forward. "I was treated like the criminal. They questioned my memory, my character, my motivations. They suggested that I was confused, that I was exaggerating innocent touches, that perhaps I had provoked them in some way. The dioceses lawyer made me repeat the most humiliating details dozens of times, looking for minute inconsistencies. A bishop asked me if I had sought reconciliation through the sacrament of confession, as if the sin were mine. This systematic re-victimization occurs through multiple mechanisms, biased investigations conducted by people linked to the institution itself, pressure to accept private mediations that favor the church, use of aggressive legal tactics to discredit testimony, and perhaps most disturbing, the mobilization of the religious community against the victim. Fabio, who finally found the courage to denounce his abuser at the age of 40, saw his entire community turn against him. The priest was loved by everyone. When my story became public, I received death threats. People I grew up with who had known me since I was a child turned away when they saw me on the street. My nephews were excluded from parish activities. I was called a liar, an opportunist, an instrument of the devil. Against the church, the abuse was horrible, but this collective betrayal of the community that I loved it almost completely destroyed me. I remember with particular clarity a young woman called Teresa who came to me when I was still a priest. With eyes empty of any light, she spoke to me words that continue to haunt me. "Father Thomas, they didn't just steal my innocence. They stole my God. They stole my sense that there is goodness in the world, that there is meaning in suffering, that there is something sacred in me that is worth protecting. How do you get that back? How?" I had no answer for Teresa that day. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that for many victims, there is no complete recovery possible. The wounds may heal, but the scars remain. visible in recurring nightmares, in fractured relationships, in decades-long struggles with depression and anxiety, in a deep distrust of institutions and authority figures. The true human cost of abuse and its systematic cover-up cannot be quantified in numbers or statistics. It is measured in lives irrevocably altered, in potentials unfulfilled, in faith destroyed, in broken trust that affects generations. Most devastatingly, much of this suffering could have been avoided if the institution had chosen to protect the vulnerable rather than protect its reputation. Today, 5 years after leaving the priesthood, my life has taken a turn that I could never have imagined when I kissed the altar on the day of my ordination. That idealistic 26-year-old young man, full of religious fervor and desire to serve, would never have predicted that his path would take him outside the institution he had sworn to serve until his death. Yet, paradoxically, I feel that I am now living a more authentic calling than ever before. I currently work with a victim support group called Truth and Healing, an organization founded by survivors of clergy abuse that offers psychological counseling, legal assistance, and, perhaps most importantly, a community of people who truly understand the unique trauma of religious abuse. Additionally, I collaborate with independent investigations, offering my inside knowledge of ecclesiastical mechanisms to help prosecutors and journalists navigate the church's bureaucratic maze. This work has deeply convinced me that the true church, the true body of Christ, is not made of stones, hierarchies, or power structures. It is not confined to imposing cathedrals or protected by Vatican walls. The true church lives in the community of authentic faith, in the honest search for truth, in concrete compassion for the wounded. As St. Paul said, we are all temples of the Holy Spirit. Each person carries within them something sacred that deserves protection and reverence. The question I most often receive, both from bewildered believers and victims seeking justice, is there any real hope for change? Can the church be redeemed? My answer is always the same. Yes, there is hope, but only through a painful and profound process of truth, justice, and transformation. Institutional, as well as personal, redemption only comes through genuine repentance and concrete reparation. This path to true redemption requires courageous and unequivocal steps. First, all secret archives in every diocese, religious order, and in the Vatican itself must be opened and examined by truly independent authorities, not by internal commissions or entities with connections to the hierarchy. The decades of meticulous documentation the Church has kept of its own abuses must come to light, no matter how painful that exposure. During an investigation I participated in as a consultant last year, a public prosecutor finally gained access, via court order, to the secret archives of a medium-sized diocese. What we found was shocking even to someone as familiar with the system as I was. Detailed dossiers on 37 priests accused of multiple abuses, including psychological assessments that explicitly identified a high risk of reoffending, but who had been systematically transferred to new parishes, often with direct access to children. Only 4 of these priests ever faced any public consequences. The second essential step to true redemption is the full accountability of leaders who facilitated and covered up crimes, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Not just the direct perpetrators, but those who signed the transfers, who silenced victims, who obstructed investigations. The basic principle of justice, that no one is above the law, must finally be applied within the Church. One of the most disturbing developments I have observed in my work with legal authorities is how bishops and religious superiors often escape any consequences, even when their complicity is well documented. In one particularly egregious case, a bishop had knowingly transferred an abusive priest to 6 different parishes over 15 years, resulting in dozens of new victims. When the scandal finally came to light, the bishop was offered early retirement for health reasons and was quietly transferred to a comfortable residence in Rome. The victims continue to wait for justice. The third crucial element of this path involves victims receiving not just financial compensation, although that is important and necessary, but a genuine and public acknowledgement of their suffering. An acknowledgement that does not come in the form of carefully worded statements by lawyers to minimize legal liability, but a candid admission of the trauma inflicted by both the abuse and the subsequent cover-up. One survivor I work with, Carolina, expressed it with cutting clarity. "I don't just want a check with a confidentiality agreement attached. I want to hear someone in authority say, 'This happened to you. It was horrible. It was our fault. We believe in you. Your pain matters, and we are fundamentally transforming our system to ensure it never happens to another child again.'" Finally, and perhaps most challenging, the system that allows and protects abuse must be completely reformed. This means dismantling the culture of clericalism, the notion that priests are quasi-divine beings beyond question. It means creating structures of transparency and accountability that include independent lay people with real authority. It means eliminating the institutional secrecy that has protected predators for centuries. One of the most promising projects I've been involved with recently is an initiative to create parish safeguarding councils, made up primarily of parents, educators, and mental health professionals from the local community, with real authority to oversee safeguarding policies and respond to concerns without clerical interference. This model restores power where it belongs, in the hands of the community that entrusts its children to the care of the Church. In my years working with survivors, I have witnessed both the terrible human cost of abuse and the extraordinary power of truth and compassion to initiate healing. If you are watching this video and have been a victim of any form of abuse, especially within a religious context, I want you to know, with as much certainty as possible, you are not alone. It wasn't your fault. Your experience matters. Your voice deserves to be heard. The truth, however painful it may be, is the only path to healing, both individual and collective. It's like an infected wound that can only be healed when drained and exposed to purifying air. And if you know someone who has been abused, the most powerful thing you can do is simply believe them. The words, "I believe in you," can literally save a life. Sometimes being truly heard is the first and most crucial step to recovery. I make this video and risk my own safety not to destroy faith. On the contrary, to try to purify it, because I deeply believe that true faith, the authentic faith that Jesus taught, does not fear the truth. It embraces it, however painful it may be. The truth, after all, is what sets us free. As a wise survivor in our support group once said, "The opposite of abuse is not just the absence of abuse. It is the presence of truth, justice, and healing." Over the past few months, I have received increasing threats. My apartment was broken into twice. I received anonymous calls late at night. An unmarked car frequently parks in front of my residence. I know there are powerful people who would prefer me to remain silent, but I can no longer hide behind silence. The faces of the victims I met, their tears, their courage, their struggle to regain some sense of peace, do not allow me to remain silent. If my testimony helps even one victim feel less alone, if it inspires even one priest or bishop to choose the truth over blind institutional loyalty, if it motivates even one community to prioritize the protection of children over the preservation of faith, then any risk will have been worth it. I'm coming to the end of this broadcast, and I honestly don't know when or if I'll be able to do another one. The risks increase every day, but the truth must continue to be shared, no matter the cost. This journey I shared today, from innocence to discovery, from reluctant complicity to active resistance, is not just my story. It is the story of countless victims whose voices were silenced, of families who were devastated, of communities who were betrayed by those who were supposed to be their spiritual guides. Leave a comment in the comments if you or someone you know has experienced abuse within religious institutions. Your story matters, and this space can become a place of mutual support and collective healing. Type truth in the comments if you believe it is time to end the silence that protects abusers in all institutions. Share this video so that more people can learn the truth about the system that for decades allowed and covered up abuse. The more exposure, the harder it will be for them to continue operating in the shadows. The light of truth is the most powerful disinfectant against...